Hello everyone. Good morning. Hope you guys are enjoying your Sunday. I'm pleased to introduce Meenakshi Prabhune. So Meenakshi Prabhune is a science writer in biological sciences. So after her completion of her Ph.D. in biophysics from Germany, she transitioned into science writing on moving to the US. After working as a freelance science journalist for a while, she now runs an educational web content at Synthego. It is a genome engineering company, and she has also written for different blogs and news articles in Biotechniques news, science news for students, and science careers, and also in the Hindu newspaper. So yeah, I would from here on let Meenakshi talk more. And first of all, thank you so much for agreeing to doing this webinar. So I think many people will get benefited from this webinar. And yeah, so the format would be like I would be asking a few basic questions to Meenakshi, and after that, like we would open this up for all the participants. You guys can write it in the chat box, and I can direct the questions to Meenakshi and she will answer it. So everybody can hear me all right? Everybody good? Okay, cool. So yeah, so Meenakshi, can you tell us more about your transition story, like how you transitioned from PhD in biophysics into scientific writing, and what made you to take this decision to take scientific writing as a career choice?
Sure. Yeah. So first of all, welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining from. I'm really happy to give this seminar because I think it's something that we all go through when we are transitioning into a different field, to have a lot of questions around it and not be sure of how you can get into the field. So I hope this would be helpful to some of you who want to transition into this field. Let me just share my screen. Okay, can you all see? I'm going to guess yes. So basically, how I got started into science writing, I did my PhD in biophysics in Germany, and then towards the end of my PhD, I realized that I did not want to continue doing bench work, and I was thinking of what could be an alternative career besides doing bench work as a scientist. I still very much wanted to stay in touch with science though, and not give up on learning new stuff. So when I was writing my thesis, I felt like I really enjoyed that process, which I think not many people can say about their thesis. And I was really satisfied at having a tangible product at the end, which, kind of I could say that I did this, versus bench work, which I found pretty frustrating to not have results at the end of the day necessarily. So that was kind of my first clue as to that I probably like science writing and this would be a good field for me. But honestly, I didn't do much about it during my PhD or like even towards the end of it at all. It was after my PhD when I moved to the US that I decided that I will look into it more seriously. So I'll just show you the my transition story and my career trajectory, and we can basically just discuss more about it later. So the first point was deciding to get into science writing, and then sometime later I finally got an internship at Biotechniques News. It was a remote internship, and Biotechniques News is a smaller kind of publication compared to say Science, Nature, or any of the big ones. And that was my kind of foot in the door into science writing. And at the same time, I was also, since I was freelancing, one of my clients was Synthego. So I used to write materials for them on their blog, just as starting out as a freelancer. And then my role kind of grew, and now I am full-time employee at Synthego. It's a biotech, a genome engineering company, and I do the scientific writing and also content strategy for their blog and educational web pages. So that was kind of, a brief overview of my transition story.
Thank you so much. So if you could tell us about your challenges that you faced during your transition, that would be great.
Sure. I think the biggest challenge for anyone who gets started in science writing is definitely the getting started part, because when I'll speak for myself, that when I decided I want to get into science writing, I read a little bit about it. The more I read, the more I realized I knew very little about it. But then the most important thing was the realization that to get into the field, you need samples. And samples are pretty much examples of what you have written before, and your thesis or manuscripts don't count, because obviously if you want to take a step into writing for non-technical audiences, as most science writing is about, then showing a technical document is not really a sample. So the first challenge itself was, how do I get these samples? And because that's what every editor would require to give you work, and where do I get these from? So there's no one sure shot answer here. And I pretty much I did like all of these things in some combination or the other to kind of build up my profile more as a writer. So I'm just going to go through these points, and then, some things work better than others, depending on your personality, depending on, what resources you have available. So as I said, there's no one right answer, but I'll just go through these. So the first thing I thought of doing and did was I started my own blog, just to get more samples. And I thought, okay, what am I passionate about? I'll write about science and traveling, and like a combination of those, since I like both of that. I also used to I started writing LinkedIn articles on LinkedIn. So that's, a platform that's available to you. And you pretty much own it. So you can write as many articles as you want on LinkedIn if getting started with a blog is too much process. Or you can just simply do guest blogging on existing blogs. So you can find someone in the field who is, who has their own blog, and maybe you can ask if you could do a guest blog. That way you are not burdened with maintaining and starting your own blog, but you kind of are already using someone else's platform to promote your work, or even to showcase your work for the first time. In similar way, there are institutions, like for one example that I know of is the American Society of Microbiology. They often take blog posts from students or beginners, or Biophysical Society does too. I had written a blog for them when I was starting out. So there are, depending on whatever field you're in, try to find institutions or people who will let you write something for them. The other advantage of doing this versus writing on your own LinkedIn or starting your own blog is obviously that there's a second pair of eyes that goes through your work and basically approves it, right? So on your own LinkedIn profile or blog, you can pretty much write anything. It does show initiative, and it shows like you're dedicated to writing, but at the same time, for the quality of it, no one has really gone through it, so you could have written anything. So just writing on someone else's blog, or writing on on like maybe a blog where someone might be editing your work, is definitely more beneficial. And then there's this other thing, which I think is really interesting, and you can get started with it even as you are in research. You don't have to necessarily be full-fledged out into science writing to start doing this, which is try writing plain language summaries of your own work in journals. You can even try doing that for writing summaries of other people's work, but that I'm not sure how many journals let you do that. But I do know that a lot of journals let you do that for your own work. So one example is eLife. eLife journal has something called eLife Digests, and that's where you can either give them a summary of your work and then they'll clean it up, or you can even ask if you could do more, if you could do that for other people's work. They have a blog post, and since I wasn't sure putting a link here if it makes sense, but I just wanted to mention that if you actually just Google plain language summary and eLife, you will find their blog post where they have compiled about 50 publications, which let you, like a list of 50 journals or even more maybe, that allow you to write your like plain language summaries of your work. So look that up for sure. And then there's applying for internships. Internships are a great way to get a foot in the door. I mentioned before that in my career trajectory, I worked in, I basically did an internship at Biotechniques News, but there are many other publications which let you do internships like Science News, The Scientist, there's this AAS Mass Media Fellowship. So check these out. Some of these may allow remote internships, some of these may not, but there's no harm checking it out. And then another thing I just wanted to mention was that ask at different companies, right? Like the way I got started was writing for a company blog, which, you know, I happened to come into contact with because I wanted to apply for a position there. But not all companies necessarily have, or I know most companies probably don't have like internship programs, but that doesn't mean they're not open to trying. Or maybe there might be actually a need for a writer, and you know, you might just ask and things might just go through. So I would just encourage you to try even asking at companies. And that's a good segue into the next point, because the way you would do that is networking with professionals in the field. So how you would do that is either doing informational interviews. Maybe you could reach out to someone on LinkedIn who's doing something that in the field that you're interested in. Like maybe you could reach out to a scientific writer, ask them about their work, or you're attending this webinar. That might give you some idea about what this profession is about. But more importantly, for networking, you would maybe join writing groups. I've given some examples here. There's this National Association of Science Writers, which is a national group in the US. It's a Science Writers Association, and you can be their member, and then you can get updates about job postings in general, a lot of, you know, useful content in general. And also they have their regular meetups, so you can join them and just meet more like-minded people, and that might hopefully help you, you know, again, break through in the field. The NCSWA is the Northern California Science Writers Association, which was something that I attended because I'm in California, and then this was a local chapter of this organization. So they have like pockets of science writers associations all over the US. And I'm sure if you're in a different country, there may be other kind of writing groups there that you could join. So look out for them, try to find them, use social media either to find these groups or even to just, you know, learn how, like follow SciCommerce, follow science writers and see what they talk about. And then you could do like a writing course, maybe, you know, a short one on Coursera, or you could even do more formal certified courses. There are science writing courses with actual degrees. And at one point in my career, I was wondering if I should go that route or if I should kind of, you know, try to do things on my own. I chose not to do that course for various reasons, but, you know, I just wanted to mention it, that there is an option of certified courses to get started if you really want to go that route. Or you could just do a combination of these things and then hopefully kind of get a break in some way. And then I just wanted to mention these 2-3 resources which are incredibly helpful in getting started as a science writer, especially science journalist. The Open Notebook is a nonprofit organization. They have their website where they have like all sorts of collections of stories, mainly to help you write. It's all for science writers. So I've just given an example here of the type of stories that they have, like for reporters, or who should trim long drafts, how much time should I spend preparing a pitch. All of these are very relevant questions that you are going to come across. And in orange here you see their pitch database, which is, again, as a journalist or a freelance journalist, pitching is something that you would send an idea of a story to an editor, and then they would decide whether they like that story or not, whether they want you to write it or not. And so pitching itself is a big deal, because that is what gets you work when you're freelancing. So there's a pitch database where different science writers or journalists, they kind of post examples of pitches which worked for them at different magazines. So it really gives you a very good example of how to navigate science journalism. And then these two books, which are almost like the Bible of science writing. First one is the Science Writer's Handbook, and then The Craft of Science Writing is very new, but that's also right up there for resources that would help. So sorry, that went on a little long, but I think like this is definitely one topic that I get asked about the most, about how to get started, and even in my experience was the most challenging part for me. So I just wanted to spend more time on it and give you all these examples.
No, thank you so much. I mean, this was really, really informative, and I think it is a wonderful resource that you have shared with all of us. And yeah, thank you very much for this. So yeah, I'm also getting a lot of questions. So I will go to all this participants' questions after this our basic questions round, and then we see what we have not covered and ask those questions. So
Sure.
my next question would be like, if you could tell us more about like what scientific writing exactly entails and how it is like different from like the common perception. So for example, like we also do scientific writing when we do a publication or stuff like that, right? And we can say that this is science writing, but how is it different from doing it in an industry level, and like how exactly at an industry you would do scientific writing, and how is it at the professional level? So if you could tell more about that, that would be great.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, because even when I was getting into science writing, I really wasn't sure of what it means, right? Like you can just put pieces together and imagine it is writing about science in some way, but what does that exactly mean? And there's like a big category of types of science writing, just based on mainly your audience and how you would write things based on that, right? Like, for example, science journalism is probably the most obvious thing that comes to mind when you think about science writing. So what does that mean? It's like news-like articles where you cover the latest papers or the latest scientific trends, and then you write it in publications. And when, in this case, by publications, I mean the news sections of any kind of magazine or online print media. Like, for example, Nature has a section called Nature News and Comment, and then that is where you would find stories about latest publications, but written in a non-technical way, so that more people can follow it, those who are just not in the field, to go and start reading a paper. Because as we all know, as scientists, the way we write papers is not really very encouraging for someone who's not in your field to understand them. You dive right into your topic, even if you have the intro, and it's pretty much meant to be read by someone who's like in your field and just wants to know what's new. Whereas if it's actually something that could be useful as a big picture thing for a broader audience to know, that necessarily does not get conveyed through a paper. So this is where science journalists come in. We are kind of like a medium of translating what the scientist wanted to say in a way that a broader set of people can understand it. So I have described here, or I've mentioned here, the type of audience who would be who you would be writing for. And in this case, for science journalism, most of the times it's either non-scientists, or it is scientists who may or may not be specialists in that particular field that you're writing about. And then there's a huge section of educational materials, right? Like someone has to write those. When you for example, go to a website where you're reading about like what's I don't know, you're reading about cancer, let's say, and then there's this whole educational thing about, what is the basis, who did what, when was the research done, all of those kind of things, depending on which website you're on. But basically, these are educational materials created by either companies or institutions or journals, as I mentioned before. And this is a very big field as well, which is science writing. In this case, again, your audience could be non-scientists, or they could be scientists who may or may not be specialists in the field, or sometimes they could even be specialists in the field and you want to educate them even further, right? Like right now, I'm sure all of you, if you're working in the lab, you have for sure once or twice gone to the website of, like, if you're doing microscopy, you may have gone to Nikon's website and seen like, oh, what do they have? What materials do they have about fluorescent microscopy? I just want to read more about that. Or maybe it's about their product that they have expanded on, right? So that is again a big thing. Like what I do at Synthego, or what I started doing at Synthego, was largely writing blogs about CRISPR, which is a genome engineering tool, to educate people who are not well versed in CRISPR about it, not necessarily non-scientists, but still maybe scientists have heard about it but don't really work with it, or those who work with it but want to know more about it. So that's definitely one big field that I hadn't thought of as much when I thought of science writing. And then there's this aspect of technical writing, which is again can be in a company, or is often in a company, where you're writing more technical things like protocols, product manuals, white papers, app notes, right? And that these are more technical, and these are generally aimed at scientists in that specific field, because they've probably bought your product and now they want to know how to use it. And in this case, it's safe to assume that, okay, that person probably knows about microscopy if they have bought my high-end microscope, and if they want to read a product manual about it, right? So this is more technical, and probably closer to the kind of writing that you would do in a manuscript, or not even a manuscript, a thesis, for instance, right? Like protocols is almost like your materials and methods, which is in detailed description of how to use some product. And product manuals are probably like a mix of maybe your introduction plus methods, and white papers are like results that you're showing using this product and how it works. So and this is just scratching the surface. I'm just giving you like a bigger overview of what this field comprises of, but you can already start seeing the variety of things that could be covered, and also kind of brings up the different levels of expertise or skills that you would need for these different things. Like writing and understanding science is the most common to them, but again, you can see that like for science journalism, for instance, if you are in news writing, it's a very deadline oriented job. It is, you cannot be talking about, very old papers like 2 years back this came out. So you are probably writing about last week this came out, which means your deadlines are very short for writing like a piece of news article. That's not necessarily true when you're working with educational materials, right? So there are like these small differences, or rather I would say there are differences which seem small when I describe all of these, but they become big when you're actually working in it, because some things are just a deal breaker for some people. Some people do not like to work under pressure, and then maybe news writing is not for you. But still, there are other ways in which, like features is an example of things in science journalism where you are covering trends about a recent trend in science, for instance, like how has microscopy evolved in the last 1 year or something, right? And that is interesting, but not really news. So that way, that is a genre you could cover in science journalism without being under pressure. So there are like these minor things, I think, which you kind of realize once you are in the field, and once you try things, that what works for you, what doesn't work for you, and what is your comfort zone, I would say, in writing.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing this. I mean, this is very enlightening to know like how diverse this field is. Like even in this scientific writing, it has so many like different layers and different types of scientific writing that exist. That's wonderful to know. So yeah, if you could let us know like how your usual day at work seems like. Like, is this more kind of flexible? Can you work from home? Can you like, or is it more of like home based? Or how many different kinds of work, um, usual day at work exists in science writing field? If you could tell us that, that would be really helpful. Thank you.
Sure. So as I mentioned before, currently I do work full time for Synthego, but I also decided to put in freelancing and how the day to day works there, because I think these are two very diverse ways of working in the same field. So, just to give you a flavor of both. So when I used to freelance, the things that I definitely enjoyed was the flexibility in time, on how I could manage my schedule, and the topics that I could cover. Because as I mentioned before, as a journalist, you kind of pick the stories that you find interesting, that you like, and then you try to get editors to like them too, so that you can write about them. But this means that you pretty much control a lot about the topic that you want to write about. So that's definitely a very big pro of freelancing. As you can also imagine, freelancers do not have a stable job. So sure, you can build relationships with editors, and then once you kind of start working more with some of them, you will get more and more of, maybe you'll write more for the same publications, but at some time there's just like some weeks are loaded and some weeks you do not have as much work. So there is less stability for sure in freelancing. The second thing it can be a little isolating without peers or colleagues around. And I did not have too much of a problem with that. But I think like if you have a personality where you need people to be around, and if that's like, if social component is a big part of your life or career or things that you enjoy, that is definitely something to think about, that you would be, at home by yourself trying to manage things. So how would a typical day look like when as a freelancer? For me, would always be a mix of like reading, pitching, writing, editing, interviewing sources. So what does that mean? Like maybe on some days, let's say I have been reading through what's new in whatever, in sciences, and then I found an interesting story. So today, let's say I found an interesting story, then the first thing I have to do is write a pitch about that story, that why is it interesting? Why am I the best person to cover it? And send it out to whatever publications that I think would be interested in it. So writing a pitch is then part of that day. Meanwhile, maybe I'm working on a second story for which I need to interview someone. So maybe my day would be half day writing up a pitch for my new story, because you have to keep the cycle going. And then also reach out to my sources, or like to call scientists to get their views about whatever other story that I'm writing about, right? So then tomorrow, obviously, I'm probably going to write a draft of that story, and then day after I'm probably going to be editing. Meanwhile, maybe this story gets approved and I have to pitch, I have to write about a draft about it again. So it's like a cycle of things, but generally has a good mix of the things that you can do, and you can choose obviously how you want to space things out. Working at a company, on the other hand, is less flexible. I mean, depending on what company you work at, you will have different, rules around how many days you can work from home, or if they have any rules at all, or they might be like, yeah, you can do whatever you want, right? So at my company, we generally I work one day from home in a week, and then rest of the days I do go in, and that's more or less the norm. Not like a strict rule, but that's more or less the norm in the company. Some weeks, if I have a lot of writing to do, I might do more days work from home, but in general, I do one day a week. So there's this less flexibility in your schedule in general, and the topics as well. I mean, thankfully, CRISPR or genome engineering is a big field, and I can still write about like a lot of good mix of topics, but still I'm still kind of limited to what the company scope is and what they are working on to kind of write on the blog. I can't just randomly write about wildlife, for instance, on the blog, right? So so that's another that's a con, definitely. On the upper side, it does have more stability because you have a full-time job, so that's definitely a contrast to freelancing. I enjoy being in a more collaborative and which is more conducive to learning, that kind of atmosphere. I am in the marketing team right now, and writing is one component of it, but it's very interesting to also learn the other things that are going on around you. And it's also a great way to network because you have a room full of experts, a company full of experts who are obviously doing different roles, but still it just widens your horizon for sure. A typical day is again a mix. There's some days are more meetings and less time to read and write and edit or whatever. Some other days it's I get more time to read and write. There's also a component of coordinating here because I manage other contract writers, so there's also more of that mix in my day.
Cool. Thank you so much. That's very insightful. Now we know about the pros and cons of like working from home or working in a company, and people can choose either of them based on their priorities. That's really great. So yeah, I mean, I'm pretty sure like any other fields, like any other fields that are not bench research, there are so many myths about those kind of careers because they are new. So you could list us some of the myth busters that is there in the field of scientific writing for people who would be starting very new, and what are those myth busters? If you could share with us, that would be really great. Thanks.
Sure. I think the one thing that is kind of assumed in science writing is that, oh, you have to be a great writer, right? Like, and I mean, don't get me wrong. Obviously, you have to like writing. Your day to day is going to have a lot of writing. So if you hate writing, obviously that's not for you. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that you have to be, a poet or like amazing at writing prose or something with complicated vocabulary and just that's a part of, let's say, creative writing, which is not necessarily as important in scientific writing. I would rather argue that the more important part here is that if you can read a paper and digest it and translate it in a way where more number of people can understand it. So I would say the more important criteria is your understanding and the ability to grasp some science and just write it in a way which is simple enough for people to understand, is definitely more valuable in science writing than just being a good writer but not having the ability to kind of get into the science and just extract the necessary information and write it without losing the accuracy, because that is definitely one major drawback, or not even drawback, but that's definitely one thing that some science writers get criticized for, that they simplify things too much, or that they kind of wrote it in a way where the original message was lost, or it became just more of clickbait, and right, like these kind of things which are more important for the integrity of your writing that you take care of. So I think that's definitely a myth, that you have to be amazing at writing, whereas I would say you have to be amazing at uh, understanding and quickly translating some research into or just science into a simpler language.
So yeah, that's pretty insightful for many of the people who would have this kind of myths that, I have to be an excellent writer to become a science writer. And I think what you said is clarity is more important than like have like humongous vocabulary and stuff like that. You do not have to be a wonderful writing like poet or something like that. Like you don't have to be a poet to become a science writer. And that's really nice. So could you let us know more about the growth in this field of science writing? Like if somebody wants to reach the managerial level positions, because whoever would be transitioning from here, they are mostly PhDs, and I think most of our participants are PhDs here. And at one point of time, they would like to go into managerial level positions. So if you could let us know more about like how you grow in this field and how you can reach the managerial level positions, and what are the things that you should do or don't do, that would be really great.
Right, sure. So again, I kind of build out a timeline for growth in career, depending on whether you are a science writer at, say, a publication, or maybe like a freelance science writer, versus if you are a science writer at a company. And then remember that these are always, you can always move laterally. You can work in a company for a while and then realize that maybe that's not the best for you, or like you don't like it as much, and you could transition into writing for a publication or going back to freelance. So there's always a possibility for lateral transfer. But let's say you are a science writer at a publication or a freelance science writer, the next growth step would be an editor. But I have to honestly say that that's not necessarily, again, for everyone. It's not an obvious growth of like, okay, you're at a certain level, you go higher and you become a manager, and now you don't, do a lot of the technical stuff, which is in a sense what it is, that you don't do as much of writing, you do more editing, and editing requires more, not just like going through the draft and marking out changes, but it requires a bigger vision of like, why are we kind of doing this, or what's the point of the story, which the writer can easily lose sight of, especially in journalism. Like when you have, say, you're writing a feature of 2,500 words and you have interviewed like 10 people, and now you're trying to squeeze in everything those number of words, that the editor has a bigger vision of, okay, out of those 10, these 5 are the most valuable, and how to make the story flow together so that people don't get bored in like the second paragraph. So that would be a natural next step if you are, if you want to grow in that direction. But I know that a lot of writers become writers because they want to stay in writing, and there's still a possibility to grow while being a writer. So as a freelance writer, for instance, when you start out, you are limited, or just you pretty much accept the rates that publications will give you, because you're just new and you just want more work in the beginning. Once you kind of get more established in the field, and once your name is out there, then you can actually increase your rates. And that's what a lot of freelancers do. The well-known ones will ask for higher rates to write a story. A lot of publications pay by word, so the rates can be hugely different for someone who's just starting out versus someone who is an expert in the field and has written for a number of years. So there is still a way to, if you really like writing and if you want to keep writing, you can still do that and just get paid more for it. And that's still growth, I would say, in the field, right? So so that's an option. And then if you become an editor, I guess the next step is you are at a magazine and you become the editor-in-chief, where you have many editors under you who in turn are managing the work of many writers. And that's like the top level thing that you can do at a publication. Of course, there might be many steps in between. I'm just giving the leaps of what kind of transition you would think of. And then at a company, a similar thing, you could become an editor, in the sense that you could, like for a blog that I'm managing at Synthego, I started out as a contributor where I would be sending blog articles and someone else would be going through them and just or like even deciding the topics or accepting the topics that I pitch. Now I am more in the position of where I drive the content strategy, or like I'm the editor-in-chief of the blog, and then I can focus more on what is the vision of this blog, what type of content do we want to cover, and then the actual writing or the actual pieces may or may not be written by me. Maybe someone else would write them, and I can mainly control the top level of what we want to write about. So that's just a very broad example of how you can progress in a career. I would say in this case, the editor level or the content strategy driving level is the manager level, because then you're managing other writers, or you are managing contract writers. You're probably managing illustrators who would in turn like work together on one article to produce a final piece. So that's the progression, I would say.
Fantastic. So yeah, that is really informative. So I would come to my last question, and I think this will cover many of the questions that I'm getting also from most of the participants. And this is like, what is the advice that you want to give to an aspiring science writer fresh out of their PhD? And I would like to club this with some of the question that I'm getting together with this, so we can cover all of them up. So many are writing that, did your PhD help you in starting your career in scientific writing? And would you recommend doing an internship during your PhD? So if you can cover this thing within this question, that would be great.
Yeah, okay. I'll start with the broader one about the advice.
Okay.
And I think, I mean, the main advice is definitely, if you can, get started early enough. Like earlier the better, right? Because there's always, I mean, the way I did it, or the way some of you might eventually end up doing it, where after your PhD, you then start thinking about now what, and then decide on this field, and then try to get into it. It's just time consuming to get into a new field. And one, it requires patience. At the same time, you're kind of unemployed, doing nothing, trying to, well, not doing nothing, but still you're unemployed, trying to get into a new field, which is frustrating for you mentally, because you are on one hand desperate to get more work, but on the other hand, it's just, you know, the matter of fact that you have to wait and just wait it out and make sure that you become good in the field. If you start early enough, if you start something while you are doing your PhD, that is definitely very beneficial, because then you're not in that desperate situation. You can try out different things, you can try out different types of writing, and then you can kind of start to get a feel of what you actually like, or versus even what you're actually good at, right? So it's I would definitely encourage anyone, not just like doing a PhD, but whatever you're working on, you know, if you're doing your master's or postdoc or PhD, or, you know, whatever phase you're in, just start early enough, and that would definitely help get you a head start. And then so that kind of ties to the question of whether you should do an internship during your PhD. I would say definitely, if you can get one, go for it. You might have to discuss with your supervisor about how much time they're willing to, or like, you know, how you would work out with the time constraints that you have in the lab, or that, you know, let's say you come to an agreement that you can spend X number of hours per week doing writing work. And I think like a lot of supervisors are, if you have a supportive supervisor, that should not be an issue. So yes, if you can already start applying for internships during your PhD, and then try to find something that, you know, helps you get the best balance, while not sacrificing on your current work, but also finding some time to take on this extra work that you can, which will help you transition later on. What was the other question?
How did your PhD help you starting your career in scientific writing?
Yeah, so I would say like a PhD is not, I wouldn't say it's essential if you want to get into science writing. It is usually beneficial, though. I mean, it was definitely for me. So I'll just give you an example of when you become, when you transition into science writing or journalism, every writer has their beat, right? Like, as in, what are you good at? Like, what are you good at that you can write well? And for me, that was a very huge spectrum, because I did my PhD in biophysics. I did my master's in molecular biology. I did my bachelor's in microbiology. So I felt comfortable by the end of my PhD in tackling different types of topics more easily than I would say if I had not done a PhD, or if I had like stopped at a certain level, that obviously I would not have the confidence to take on new topics or learn new things. Like, while doing a PhD in biophysics, I was in a physics institute, which was way out of my comfort zone, but that kind of helped me realize that I can pick new topics and like I can learn if I want to fast enough. And I think that definitely was a transferable skill, which helped me later during writing, that I was confident enough to take on topics which I think normally you would think twice before of whether you would understand it, whether you can learn it. Like, you can't be an expert at everything beforehand. On the flip side, for some of you who might have done like their bachelor's, master's, PhD in like, a more straight line kind of topics, that's also great, because then now you are like, let's say you've been working on some aspect of stem cells throughout your research. Now you are pretty much a topic expert on that. And so if you versus I would be pitching for writing a story about stem cells, you would probably get it, because you have done 10 years of work in that, right? And I have dabbled in different things. So there are pros and cons to both, but I think a PhD definitely has a lot of transferable skills besides just your actual project that kind of helps you later in whatever field you transition in, for sure.
Okay, fantastic. So I'm clubbing some questions together. So some of the questions are regarding scope of science writing in India. What is the scope of science writing in India? And internship and companies where such opportunities are available in India. So these are all like question based on geographic location. I saw another question. Do you have suggestions for internship in India? So these are some specific questions regarding the scene of scientific writing in India. If you have any kind of knowledge about this,
Right. Yeah. So I mean, I don't. I have like bits and pieces of knowledge. Obviously, I don't have first-hand experience of doing anything in or from India. But I 2 years back, I gave a talk at NCBS, and I know that they have a science journalism workshop every year. So they also have a communications department. So I'm not sure about how many universities in India have that, but I do know that NCBS has one. University in Hyderabad has one. Pune has ISER Pune has a communications department as well. So it's, from what I've seen, it's growing. And I mean, and this is just like, I can't say at what rate because I wasn't there when it started, but I am just noticing a lot more of communications focus in India as well. There is, so I would say that for those who are kind of looking for opportunities in India, the best way would be to reach out to some of these people on LinkedIn who are in India, in working at either communications in NCBS or in any of these other cities. So look out for science communicators in India, and then try to see what how their transition was. If they kind of, did they need courses, or did they take a leap the way I did, where they kind of went after their PhD into just writing. If for freelancing from India, you can anyways also write for any national, international publication from India. So as far as I know, there are no restrictions as to that you have to be a writer in the US to write for a US publication. Some might have those if they don't want to get into the complications of payment methods, but a lot of them are open to international writers, right? So that means that you can still try and apply for all of the things that I mentioned before. Then if there are remote internships, there's no reason why someone from India cannot apply. If there are like remote kind of like if you're pitching for some publication, you're anyways working remotely, so it shouldn't matter. So this is kind of, I know that there are things spurting out here and there. Mostly what I told you was around universities. I don't know about companies. Unfortunately, I'm not really aware of how internships at companies work, but actually I'm also not aware of that in the US. As I mentioned before, I think I didn't know of any company that has like a specific writing related internship program, because honestly, that's not a company's focus, right? And sometimes, as I said, maybe asking and then creating that position works better, because they might not have thought about it. They didn't want to spend their energy going out and looking for someone. But if someone offers their services, they might be open to try it out and just be like, okay, write for us and we'll see how it works. So that's always a possibility. I think indiabioscience.org has resources around science communication in India. Like, as far as I know, that's a big portal for science communication in India. So check that out, and maybe you might find more helpful resources there as well.
Okay, so thank you. And there are one or two more questions about the country location. I'm clubbing them up so it's easier for you. So any suggestions for options outside the US, in Singapore, UK, or Germany? And another question is, does it matter which country you are based in for an entry into some science writing through this websites which you mentioned?
Right. I think a broader answer would just be that I don't think it matters in most cases for which country you are in for writing, as long as you're a good writer, right? So I do know people who work all across the world and just still find work. So it's not. I would say it's not like a hard and fast thing. In general, for any local stuff, because it's hard for me to know like specific publications. But one thing I would definitely say is that where would locals have an advantage is providing local based stories, right? So I cannot sit here and write about what is the current issue in Bangalore, but if you are in Bangalore and if you have seen a trend which is either in like healthcare or just basically something that's very endemic and local to your spot, which obviously someone outside does not know of, that's a great angle for you to write about for any publication, because they don't have someone doing that for them. So wherever you are, find those, and then find those angles if you want to pitch stories outside for international publications. I forgot the name of this person. So for Singapore, I was thinking there is definitely some kind of Asian outlet, and I think her name is Juliana something. I'll have to find that. But basically, there are outlets also very specific for like it's an Asian science writing magazine, and then again you probably have an advantage being in Asia to apply for that. So so check those out for local stuff. In Germany, I'm not sure about a specific organization as such. I think like labbiotech.eu is a good website in general for like covering biotech, not just news, but even trends around Europe. I'm not aware if they take freelancers, if you have to work full time with them, but whatever, that's, you can figure it out. That's a good one to get started with, to just see what type of writing they have and if that might help. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So another question that I'm getting is, I think you covered most of the part of this question. This question is for someone with a full-time job, uh, in bracket read PhD or postdoc. How will you grade different things you tried according to their demands in terms of time and daily hours? So I think she basically wants to know about your preparation, like how much time you dedicated for your preparation. to do, like while you are doing a job, full-time job or a PhD?
Right. So again, as I said before, that in my transition, I started that after my PhD. So I had the luxury of having more time to get into it, which is, has both its pros and cons. I think if you are doing a PhD or a postdoc, uh, it's really hard to say, like, to give a general number, but because, I don't know how much demanding your lab work is, or how supportive your supervisor is. But I think, like, you break down things into sections of shorter goals. Like, let's say, just for example, in 2 weeks, give yourself 2 weeks for just figuring out stuff that you need to know about science writing, or like just figuring out a plan for, here are the 4 publications that I think I would like to write for, right? Like, some are smaller ones and are easier to get into than, like, obviously writing for Nat Geo or Wired or Science or Nature, which are like big level publications, which are hard to break into. Not impossible though, obviously, but as a beginner, maybe start small, so that you have less pressure on yourself, and it just gives you some time to grow. So maybe I would start with, like, making a list of those publications, and then thinking about, like, okay, what topic do I have? Does it fit into these publications? Can I write for those? And then go from there. If you know someone at that publication, if you don't know someone at that publication, but over LinkedIn someone in that topic, ask for an informational interview to just chat with them about things. I did this when I was starting out, and I was really amazed and impressed at how helpful some people are. And or like, some people will just try to take the time for you. It may not be always possible, so don't be disheartened if you write to someone on LinkedIn and they don't reply, or that they are not available for a phone call. Everyone gets a lot of requests all the time, so it might not always work out, but it will work out with some of them at least, and that can be a good way to kind of learn more and get more into stuff. Especially an advantage if you are at university is use your university resources, right? Like, some universities have newsletters or stuff like, there's a lot of stuff going on at universities, which, depending on how active you are, you're either a part of or blissfully unaware of. And the advantage of being in a university is that you can actually use this. So maybe that's a great place to start. Find out if your university has a press office, right? Like, are they already writing, like, short excerpts of latest research in the field? If they are, can you be part of the team? If they are not, would they like someone to do that, right? So this is, either join in people who are doing it or create something for yourself. But yeah, I know it's not, I couldn't give like exact time frames for stuff, but as I said, it's really hard to kind of mention how much time you can spend on things. Like, when I was doing my internship, there was like a minimum number of stories you need to do per month, but there's no maximum. So you could, if you're doing a PhD or a postdoc, you could probably hit the minimum, which was, in my case, it was like 4 stories per month, but it might be different for different publications. But then I ended up writing 6 because I was not doing a full-time job. So it's, you'll find your footing just once you start testing the waters, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, there are like lots of questions. One interesting question that I'm seeing is somebody asked about investigative science journalism. So if you know anything about this kind of career, like can you, how prolific is science writing as a career in India right now? You have already mentioned that. Also, can you shed some light on investigative science journalism? How good is it to venture into this and consider it as a career? So do you have any idea about that?
So I think, like, when I say science journalism, or like investigative science journalism, for me kind of go hand in hand, in the sense that you are digging into a story and you call up scientists and ask for their opinion, and then just let's take an example of, you are looking into one research paper, you'll call up the authors, you will ask their views about their paper, why they think it's important, then you will call up a second person in that field who had nothing to do with that work, so almost like an unbiased peer review kind of thing, and you'll ask them, what do you think of this work, right? And then you might ask maybe a third person, depending on how big your story is, you might ask like 2-3 other people. So this kind of is called investigative science journalism, because what you are doing is you are taking a story, in this case a scientific paper, and you're investigating its relevance, its use and everything, and that all will be reflected in your story. So you're not just a sounding board for the authors, and your role is not just to promote their work. You want to do that, but you basically want to put forth good science. So if a paper comes out, and you might have seen this, there are so many controversial papers as well, right? So in that case, as a journalist, you are supposed to be unbiased, where you write about that story, but you also write about 5 other scientists said that this is not like a breakthrough, which what is being shown or like assumed about this paper. So be careful about how you interpret it, and that is still journalism, even if you have to write negative views of your peers about a paper. So whatever I spoke about, like freelance science journalism, kind of ties together with investigative journalism. I don't see it as like a different field that needs a different preparation in general.
Mhm. Yep, it's wonderful. And there are some questions which are like to send kind of a resource, which is a book called Crafts of Scientific Writing. So yeah, I think we can ask them to contact you directly through LinkedIn or something, or then probably you can send them. Like, one question is it Craft of Scientific Writing or Craft of Science Writing? And can you send the ebook? So this is one question. Another question.
So I'll just answer that right away.
Yeah.
There is no
Mhm.
ebook because this is a very recent book.
Okay.
There are like Amazon. It's available on Amazon, and
Mhm.
if you just type in the Craft of Science Writing, it's by Siri Carpenter. And hopefully we'll send you a recording of this webinar so you can go through it and look at the slide again. Where I have written the name, so you can find it easily on Amazon. So yeah, I mean, I don't have the ebook basically. This is a very new book that came out, but it might be worth a copy if you are starting out, or if you are at an institution, check if they might buy you a copy to help you out.
Mhm. Another question is, hi Meenakshi, I had written a report on mental health volunteers meet dated 18th January. Can you help me in pitching it somewhere? Thank you in advance for your valuable suggestions.
So I think like one issue with, I really try my best to help out people in like getting into this field or getting started with their career, but it becomes really difficult to kind of work on a pitch with someone. Basically,
Mm.
I would have to get into that story with you to extract the best out of it. And then secondly, I think like pitching is really, it's very annoying, but it is the core of the thing you would need as a science, if you want to develop as a science writer, to be able to extract the essence of your story, right? Like pitches generally don't work through mediates. If I know an editor, I cannot pitch to them and say that, hey, I know someone else who will write that story, because that just does not serve the purpose, right? Like it's saying that, I mean, would you give contract to someone to build a house if they couldn't give you an example of how they can build a house, or like if they can't show you their own expertise at it? So that's one reason why third party pitches don't really work. I cannot in that sense help you pitch something. I think though a very useful thing would be to go to the pitch database in Open Notebook, because there you can see and identify what publication does your story fit best with. To just give a very obvious example, where would you send a story about technology, right? Like Wired or Nat Geo? And where would you send a story about wildlife? Like these are obviously very obvious examples where you know that wildlife goes in Nat Geo and technology goes to Wired, but it's not always that obvious. But then the pitch database has many examples where you can see like, oh, my story is more related to food, and what kind of publications could I pitch to, right? So that might really help you.
Yeah, cool. Another question is regarding the degrees. Like, is PhD a necessary prerequisite to become a science writer? And I have seen somebody else asking, is there any benefit of doing a postdoc for being a science writer? So yeah.
Yeah. So as I mentioned before, I think they are not essentials. They are always, helpful. It's hard to say if you doing a postdoc will necessarily make you a better science writer. That probably won't be the case. But if it's going to add to your level of expertise, that makes you more of a subject matter expert, it might help, right? So it's not, I would just keep it brief by like, degrees are not necessarily the essential part of science writing. It's how you use them, basically. So maybe a postdoc might be completely useless if it doesn't really, like if you don't know how to use that in your science writing thing, or a master's might absolutely be enough if you get into it early enough and just start at it. Like I know people who have done it both ways, and it's fine either ways.
And regarding to that, another question, and I think you have answered that, we have covered this thing. Is a degree in science communication essential to make the transition to from PhD to science writing? Does it make it significantly easier to find stable work in science writing if you do science communication degree or something like that?
Yeah, so it is not essential. It definitely might make things easier, because you might, if you are a part of a program, just like when you are doing masters, finding internships are easier when you are part of a program. That way things might get simpler, but eventually you're investing the same amount of time, let's say, right? Like if you are struggling and trying to make it on your own, you're probably going to spend a year trying to figure it out. If you're going to get a degree in communications, you're also spending a year. Now you're just in a more streamlined path. So it's really up to individuals on whether they want to spend the time or the cost. Well, time, as I said, you might eventually just spend it anyways, but the cost associated with the course, or like just the mental energy associated with the course, if you want to do it or not. So it's definitely not essential. Again, since I have not done it, I don't have an absolute way of saying comparing. It can obviously be beneficial because one, you get a degree, and two, you might get foot in the door more easily.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. And we're coming to the end of this, like last few questions. These are very small questions. So another is, what do you, oh yeah, please.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to cover one which I had like a few questions from Twitter beforehand. So I just want to quickly go through them to not ignore them. So one important one which I really want to answer is dealing with imposter syndrome. A lot of us have it. It's just imposter syndrome is when you feel like whatever you've achieved is by fluke and you're not really good at something, right? And that is very difficult in all spheres, obviously, in whatever field you're in. But obviously with writing, it's even worse, because every time you write a new piece, you have to deal with yourself to kind of publish it and not worry about, that, oh, this is going to be terrible and everyone's going to hate it, kind of a thing. So I think like what helps really in this case is to put things in perspective. When I started my blog and when I wrote my first article, I was terrified about throwing things out in the internet and having the whole world look at something, and then, obviously with the fear of like, I'm going to sound so stupid, everyone's going to hate this, or people will just be like, what the hell, why is this person even a writer, right? So, but the good thing, or not, it's not really a good thing, but to think about it is like, how many articles do you remember which, were the worst articles of your life? You probably start reading something, you might not like it, you just close the browser, right? Like, do you even remember what you didn't like? And forget about like didn't like or hated, there might be something controversial about it, but do you remember mediocre articles? Because I would say 90% of the times your article might be mediocre. It's hard to be the best or the worst at something. So mediocre articles, you're obviously going to even forget. And then the even more important thing, which now I see even more, now that I'm a bit ahead in the field, is that it is so hard to get someone to read something you wrote. So honestly, think of it this way. If you are just starting out and if you're just writing your first article, chances are very few people are going to read it. Like all of you are attending my webinar. I don't know how many of you even read the things that I wrote, right? And that's fine. Like, I just know now that there is so much information that exists on the internet, and there are so many ways that people get their information, that it's one article existing out somewhere is, it's like almost like a dot in the space where it may or may not be read, people may or may not remember it. So if you are dealing with imposter syndrome about, am I good enough, just try to pacify yourself by thinking that it's not like end of the world. This is not something that the whole world is going to read. It's probably something that 10 people are going to read starting out, probably your mom and your family being like 5 of them. That's how it was for me when I started out. So so that kind of helps you get calm yourself a bit, and then once you start getting into the rhythm of it, you'll get more used to it. The second thing was about managing research and getting into science writing simultaneously, which I kind of just mentioned before, that I would highly encourage it to try and do this. And it's honestly hard to predict your timetables, but if you can, you should definitely get into it sooner than later. And then another thing was like balancing accuracy of what you write with, the fact that you have to simplify content. And I think this is really, really important as a science writer. And that's why I mentioned one of the things as like the myths that, this is an underappreciated skill that people probably don't assume when they think about science writing, that you need this. This is what you should practice. Uh, try maybe take your friend's paper or your colleague's paper and try writing a short summary of it and show it to your colleague and ask like, do you think this is accurate? And then show it to someone else and ask, who's not in the field, and ask if it's simple enough. Did they get what you were trying to say? These are like 2 ways in which you can start trying to balance accuracy with simplifying content, because often enough, when you're writing for publications, you don't have the liberty or the luxury of going back to the authors and getting everything checked from them. Like, you're not supposed to show your final article to the authors just so that you're not influenced by them. And that kind of often is the worry of scientists, that, oh no, they are going to misrepresent what I said, they're going to blow it out of proportion, or they're going to write something wrong. And so as a writer, it's your job, or it's upon you to make sure that what you write is accurate, yet simple. So if you are practicing something, that is definitely something I would advocate that you practice. You can ask your remaining ones, Shamtanu. I'm done.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's there are not many questions that I can see. One is I think this one you have covered already. Would you have any advice for promoting one's blog? Like, you have covered the pitching part, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, like, promoting one's blog, I would say, use social media. When I just started Twitter, it was really hard for me to just, get used to it. Or even self-promotion is difficult for people. You don't like to kind of brag about yourself, but that's something that's important for you to do in order for people to see your work. So I would say 2 or 3 things. Use social media. If your blog is new and if you want more people to know about it, try doing cross posting, where you do a guest post on some other blog with whoever, either someone you know or you find someone who is in the field and would like to have you guest blog, and then they write on your blog, and then that way you're both promoting each other's work and each other's blogs. So that's like an easy-ish, or at least, convenient way to do it, I would say. And what else? Like, honestly, I think you just, once you start with social media and spread the word and be consistent about writing, it just gets more easier over time. So don't be afraid to promote yourself.
Yeah, and also this is also true for pitching your ideas to editors, right? So another question is, could you please tell me more about pitching and how to reach out editors when you are starting freelancing? Is it the same way, like kind of?
Reaching out, no, I mean, like, reaching out editors you wouldn't do through social media. You would,
Okay.
whatever publication that you want to write for, generally on their website, they have the information of the editor associated with that, and then the email addresses. So you would reach out to that email address. Generally, a pitch is broken down into what is the story about, and that does not mean just linking out to a PDF saying, I want to write about this. It should really show that you should be able to extract the important part of the paper, or why it is important from there, and write it in, like, whatever, in some cases one paragraph, in some cases 2 paragraphs, whatever makes sense. Just extract the story, and then after that, say why you are the right person to write the story. Because as I mentioned before, if your whole life you've worked on stem cells and done something very much cell culture based, and if you want to write about wildlife, you are going to get questions about, like, why would you write about that, right? Like, just finding an interesting story is not necessarily enough. You have to show some skill around it. And maybe your answer is that I have written about wildlife before, and you send a sample. And that could be as simple as that. So pitching is, I would say, literally a whole new, could be a webinar of its own, literally, because there are so many do's and don'ts there. But I think, like, a short answer would be, find the publications that you find you want to write for, write to their editors, be prepared for rejection. Don't take it personally, because oftentimes rejection is not necessarily like you suck, but it's more about that this story is not right for my publication right now, or that you probably are not the best suited writer to write it for me right now. And that's also okay. You cannot predict who you are up against, right? And so yeah, you start getting more used to it once you start doing it. So once you have a few samples, because you are going to have to send some samples for an editor to trust you with to write something, just try and start getting used to those no's, because they will come, but that's okay. It's just normal.
All right, we're coming almost to the end. Last one question is, can you explain more about how working at a company is more conducive to learning? As a freelancer, wouldn't you also be learning as you would be researching many different topics? So the difference between freelancing and working at a company. So that's what I meant.
Sure. I think it's just, basically how we are defining learning. I'm not saying you don't grow as a freelancer, because every news story you write, you are reading a lot of papers, you are researching about, like, the right story to write about. And so that's definitely learning, as in increasing your knowledge kind of thing. I guess what I meant was being more conducive to learning is that, a thing that comes in collaborative space is that you don't know the things you don't know, right? Like, you cannot, like, when you're reading a scientific paper, sure, you'll get more, you'll get more knowledge about the subject, but, like, the things that I just told you right now, for example, how to market yourself, how would you know that if you weren't literally searching for how to market yourself? And how would you know that you even need to market yourself unless you see someone else doing it, and then realizing that, oh, that was an angle that I hadn't thought about, and now I know, and now I can do it myself. And that's the kind of growth I think that you get from your colleagues, or people who are in the field but doing a different type of job in a company, where you see that, okay, in a marketing team, I'm seeing how events is being run, and I've never organized an event, or I have never had to like this is probably it's just a new field for me. So those kind of things are things that you learn along the way, where you see that, okay, if I have to give a webinar, how do I make sure I get you know X number of registrants, and what do I make sure that, how do I make sure they get value out of it, and how do I make sure that more people will attend next time. Like all of these are things that you can only think about once you either have seen someone do it, or if that's your main goal. But if you're a writer, generally, or whatever field you're in, you have a one track mind where you're trying mostly to focus on the task at hand, and it's hard to think of all these other things, because as I was saying, when I wrote a blog, I just assumed that the whole world is going to see it, and that's a scary thing. And then it took me a while to realize that the whole world doesn't even know I have a blog, right? And that's when you realize that you need marketing, and that's when you realize, like, oh, here's how some others have done it. So it's that kind of growth. I wouldn't say it's you don't learn anything as a freelancer. It's just what you learn, right? It's a mix of it's just different things or different experiences that you get learning on your own versus learning with others.
Yeah, that's explained very well, I think. So one last question about the internship, and then I think we have covered everything. So this question is, maybe you already mentioned, are there internship volunteering opportunities in private biotech or pharma companies? If yes, how to get started on that? And I'll club another question with that is are those internships paid? Like, are those paid internships? So
I think the answer to both is could be, right? Like, I don't know. As I mentioned before, not all pharma companies necessarily have like a formal internship procedure because, again, that might not be their main objective. That's not to say they wouldn't be open to someone getting like trying things out. So for companies, it's slightly a bit different than publications, which basically publications, like life and blood of those is science writing. So they obviously have structured it a bit more to get in new people in there and make sure they have a constant supply of writers and that they provide value to other writers. Whereas companies have a different goal. They need to sell their product, they need to make a drug, they need to do whatever their actual goal is. And then writing is not their main focus. It could be if you show the value in, like, hey, there is, I have worked in pharma for years and I could write stuff for you on your blog, or I could do something that could help you market it. And then they might be open to accepting that value and then giving you a paid internship or whatever in return. So it's hard to comment on or like, I don't know of specific paths that every company has. Some of them may even have actual internship programs. I don't know of any, but I also know that you can actually, it's probably, easier to knock a door and just see if they open it, right?
okay, awesome. I think that's it. Thank you so much, Meenakshi. This was like really, really great webinar, and I think many people have learned a lot from this, and people are yeah, thanking you. Like, yeah, I think it's really good and informative, and I think we can do a lot more in future of this kind of webinars, and you can tell us more as and when you are getting higher up in your ladder, and you can share us more. And yeah, to all the panelists, this webinar is getting recorded, and this will be there in the website, in the and also in the Stampiers Facebook group. So you can watch this later as well, and those slides will also be there. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. And yeah, I really hope this helps you. And I know we, for some of the things we just were barely able to scratch the surface. So maybe, if you have specific things that were not covered or could use a webinar of its own, we like happy to do this again with a more in-depth topic. But yeah, good luck to everyone who's trying to get in the field. I think it's the starting part is the most difficult, but then once you get into it, you'll get used to it. And thank you, Shantanu and Stempiers, for giving me this, opportunity to voice my story and just help people doing that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thanks, guys. Have a good Sunday. Bye.
Bye.